G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Today we are taking your questions from the ballboysnba.com. Let's go!
Jordan open. Chicago with the lead. Bryce to Shaq.
Not a game. We talking about practice.
LeBron James with no regard for human life. Anything's possible.
Back out to Allen. His three-pointer. Curry for three. Wow! Unbelievable. Making it rain in New York. We the North are now we the champions.
Not the destination, it's the journey. Mamba out.
G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Casey, and you can find me on Twitter at BallBoysNBA and on Instagram at Ballboys Fantasy Basketball. Today, we are going through your questions that have been submitted over at ballboysnba.com by subscribers. If you wish to have your questions answered on the podcast in depth, in detail, you can head over to ballboysnba.com and become a subscriber, log in. $10 will cover you for the entire season. We will continue to do these kind of podcasts sporadically throughout the preseason, and then hoping to do it maybe once every week or once every 2 weeks in the regular season. So you can take ask team-specific questions, help with trades or waiver wire pickups, or if you're drafting from a particular spot or whatever have you, feel free to send through the questions over there. They need to be sent through at the exclusive Q&A podcast tab at ballboysnba.com, and to see the little blue ask question box there, you need to be making sure that you're logged in as a subscriber. And those will be sent through to me, and they are the questions that I will get to, and I will be doing my best to answer 100% of all of those questions. So if you ask a question on there, I will make sure that I get to it. So let's get through it today, guys. Just a few on today's podcast. So first one here is a really good question here. I actually like the thought of this question here. So the question is basically talking about how much do I take playoff scheduling into account, but especially and specifically talking about players providing value in low volume categories such as blocks. The example here is that Gobert, Poeltl, Mobley, Jarrett Allen, and Mitchell Robinson are some of the best shot blockers in the game, but only have a 2-game week during the fantasy playoffs. Would you then value other players like Embiid, Porzingis, Time Lord, and Miles Turner, or considering punting the value, the pick or the category, altogether, or do I just ignore the schedule completely? It's a tricky one, and it does. I like the way you're thinking. I think obviously, especially with those low volume categories, it can make a huge difference. It can. And there's a bit of luck involved, really. Like if you have a 2-game week, and if you have a player like Gobert and you block 4 shots in both those games, so there's 8 blocks for the week, and that's the same as 4 games with 2 blocks. So there's going to be a higher degree of variance, or you might go a game with no blocks, and then you're only going to get 1 or 2 blocks out of Gobert for the whole week, where you were expecting a little bit more. So it does increase the variance. It does increase the risk of a category like that. I don't know if I would go as far as to say that because of that reason you should punt that category. I still think that you base your punting decisions and your punting strategies depending on the players that you pick within the first couple of rounds or first 2 to 3 rounds. And if a player that, does get a lot of the value from blocks falls in your draft, I still think that you take them. But maybe you use it as a bit more of a tiebreaker kind of a thing. I do really like players. You've mentioned a few guys there. I do really like Porzingis. Embiid I've got at pick 3, so he's pretty high on my rankings already. There are some guys that you didn't mention here that might be able to contribute in blocks in Jalen Smith, someone like Isaiah Jackson if there's a trade. Even players like Jabari Smith Jr., Alperen Şengün, those guys that maybe aren't providing elite blocks, but they can still help you in those categories. So I still think it's fine. I wouldn't be scared off too much by those guys having a low volume days in one of the playoff weeks, because again, you've got to get to your playoffs, and I think we undervalue that a little bit in a lot of talking here. Obviously, if you're tuning into this podcast and if you're listening to everything I say, I do think you're going to have a good chance to make your playoffs, but some things can happen. Injuries to star players can happen, and you might be without a player for a good while. So if you have a player in your first round and blocks are something you want to look after, then I think you still look after it. And I wouldn't let this dissuade you from searching at your blocks if you are otherwise going to do that. However, punting blocks is definitely a good strategy. If you get a guard and you don't want to reach early for a player like a Miles Turner or like a Jakob Poeltl or a Gobert, and you're trying to look after your free throw percentage as an example, then you maybe just punt that category. I think it's very dependent on the players that you draft. I think that, and again, especially with the Robert Williams news, he's going to be likely out to start the season, and his knees raise a bit more of a risk. Blocks are going to be hard to come by. They're going to be very valuable, and players like an Evan Mobley, Anthony Davis, those guys get a bit of a bump, even though they are a bit of a risk. Obviously, Mobley with the risk of him not breaking out where he's being drafted, and Anthony Davis with his health. But I still think that those guys are worth it, and especially when they provide other things as well. So I think Mobley will provide you good points and assists. Anthony Davis will provide you good points and rebounds and steals. So I would try to prioritize those guys and bump them up my board. A player like Mitchell Robinson, Miles Turner, where their value is so highly predicated on the blocks, I do drop them down compared to their per-game ranks. If you go check out, obviously, the season guide, you'll see that Miles Turner's ranking that I've given him is a fair bit lower than his rank last season, even though he's in a pretty similar position. Just because if he even just drops half a block a game per game, he is going to fall a lot in the rankings. So I probably haven't answered your question with 100% certainty, but I guess the biggest takeaway here is that I wouldn't just eliminate the guys who get blocks because of the schedule. I'm not too fussed about that sort of a thing, but again, if you don't want to reach on those guys regardless, I think it is fine to ignore that category altogether and lean into a bit of a punt. It is a good strategy. I think it's definitely one that you can do, and even if you do punt that category, if these guys fall far enough, they're still fine to get, especially those guys that provide value elsewhere. So I guess that's my answer. It's a bit of don't really pay attention to the schedule, and if my build doesn't suit it, then I'm happy to punt the category. But I wouldn't let it scare me too much, especially players like Gobert, like a Jakob Poeltl, who I am pretty confident that they're going to repeat those numbers because they've done it, years and years in a row. All right, let's move on to the next pick. What are your thoughts on trading picks? Something that this person does every year. He goes back in the draft and will have their first pick at around 34, but will have 10 picks by 55. So not every league allows this, and often is the case that most leagues don't. I personally think that in a redraft league, I'm not the biggest fan of trading picks. I know that it is something that's fun and adds another element to the draft, but I think as soon as you start to attach names to those kind of things, it makes the draft and makes the trades, often in retrospect, feel really one-sided more often than not. In a dynasty league, I'm a bit more okay with it because you've got different strategies. Some people rebuilding, some people wanting to win that year. It makes a bit more sense to be trading picks in that kind of a draft. But I'm not the biggest fan as a commissioner of allowing picks to be traded in a draft. If your league does allow it, however, I think fine. Yeah, it's a great strategy. It almost turns into the same kind of strategy as like an auction draft in like that balanced versus stars and scrubs kind of mindset. So in that respect, I'm a big fan of what you're doing there. I think it's a good way to go about it because I prefer the balanced strategy. It insulates you from injuries. So if you're relying on your first round pick and they get injured, you're pretty much screwed. Whereas if you've got a few more picks in that late early rounds or the middle rounds there, you can definitely take those hits if some players do get injured and cope a lot better there. You can often get a few guys that break out into early round value anyway. So I think, yeah, it's a good strategy if your league allows it. I personally, just as a commissioner, don't really like to be trading picks during the draft or before the draft. I would rather just allow everyone to do their trades once the draft is finished, because then it's a bit more transparent on what you're trading for what. Okay, so in a draft, it's hard to know who's going to go where. So there's often wild swings in value, and the drafts often in retrospect show that there's very lopsided trades in my experience. So those are my thoughts on there. But hey, if your league's all for it, then I say, yeah, it's a great strategy, and yeah, I would tick it off and endorse that. Next question here is about this offseason. So this is the first quote-unquote normal offseason that we've had in a few years, and he's asking if we think that there's any player scenarios that we think this especially will help. So talking about older guys, players with injuries, players with random drops in free throw percentage like Anthony Davis and McCollum, or if there's any players that I think this hurts that might come into this season out of shape. I don't usually put a lot of stock into this, and similarly to how I didn't really think that the shorter offseason hurt a lot of other guys, although LeBron James obviously... LeBron James was awesome last year in a per-game rankings, and he was obviously one of the oldest guys in the league. Chris Paul's been great the last couple of years. He did have a little bit of injury last year, but the year before that, he was completely healthy, and that was a very short off-season. So I don't really think that it's all up in the air. I think there's no real correlation between off-season length and older guys doing better or worse. I think that the guys who take care of themselves are going to do great. They're good players. They know what they're doing. Maybe we see less resting from the players that made the finals. The Celtics, I don't think you're going to see much resting. Maybe Al Horford, but now that Rob Williams is going to be nursing the knees, maybe not now. Golden State, you might see Draymond, Clay, and Steph get some rests and back-to-backs here and there. But I don't think that it being a normal offseason really helps anyone in particular. Maybe someone like like you've listed here, Fred VanVleet, maybe because he's, lots of high minutes, and that's kind of usually been the cause of his injuries. But I don't really put too much stock into it, really, is the short answer. So I think those are sort of things that we're starting to overthink a little bit too much now. And I think you're better off focusing more on the stats that they're going to put up, building your constructed roster based on your punt builds and the value in those categories. Other factors like players getting older and more experienced in the NBA, players getting older and more injury prone, and those sort of things, I think is more what you should be focusing on. Maybe a player like Anthony Davis is a name that maybe comes to mind. He's obviously, I think he said, there was a quote earlier on that he hadn't touched a basketball in like 3 months. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, or I don't know. It at the end of the day, I'd be totally guessing if I was to give you a legitimate answer. So I don't really take or pay much attention to those kind of things when evaluating players. So, and last question here, guys. It's about how to approach an 18-team head-to-head 9-category league draft. On this league, there's 7 active starters and 3 bench spots, with 3 IL spots, or 2 IL spots and 1 IL plus. And how would I approach this? So, with the deeper leagues, I've just recently released... you would have seen, I think it would come out before this video and this podcast, you would have seen my snake draft strategy guide. In that one there, I talk about my early, mid, and late round strategies, and I think that those strategies still apply to deeper leagues, because what you're trying to do, so say you're picking in the, your 9th round, you're going to be picking in the pick 140s or whatever the case may be. I can't quick maths off the top of my head, but you'll be picking where we would traditionally be taking flyers. What you'll be wanting to do in that situation is still looking for solid guys to fill your starting roster spot, although you do only have 7 active starters. So I would still be taking the approach of wanting to fill my 7 starters with really solid guys that I'm really confident in, not taking huge upside gambles and swings unless they can produce the amount of value that I'm expecting them to do in the minutes that I want them to start the year in. So I think that don't get too crazy with the flyers earlier on when you might be expected to do that in other shallower leagues. I think in this kind of a spot, it is a bit more okay to take flyers on some guys because there are more picks between your pick and the next time you have a selection. So I think that is something that you do need to adjust for. Especially if you're on the turn, for example, you're going to have a lot of picks between your rounds, so it's okay to take that bit of a reach. I'm more inclined to reach in the later rounds than I am in the earlier rounds. So maybe after the 3-round mark in that type of a league, I think it's fine to reach 10, 15 spots would be okay because you got to get your guys. You got to get the guys that fit your build. And you also asked about punting. Yes, I think more inclined to do some heavier punting strategies in this kind of a league because there's going to be obviously more teams doing different things. You're going to have to differentiate yourself from each team in order to get a step ahead. So I would be more aggressively punting multiple categories in a scenario like that, so I can be extremely strong in a few different areas. And I would think that is more so the case because it's going to be very hard to be balanced enough to beat these guys because there are just more teams in the league. And as well with the injury-prone players, if you listen to that other podcast that we put up about that strategy with the early, middle, and late round strategy, I would follow that kind of advice. Early rounds, try to get safer guys. Max of only one injury or quote-unquote risky guy in the first 3 rounds. And try not to get too many of those guys on the same thing. You do have 3 IL roster spots, so that does help. But the difference there is that when your player gets injured and you're replacing him with someone off the waiver wire, it's someone a lot worse than in a shallower league. So perhaps you are a little bit more cautious because the replacement value is not as good, especially in those earlier rounds. So maybe just fade those riskier guys back, maybe 10 spots or so than you otherwise would normally. But I would still follow the general principles that I discussed in that video in your league versus a standard league as well. So hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, if you guys have any further questions, let me know over at ballboysnba.com. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can see that blue little icon down the bottom right-hand corner of the page there. Even if you didn't ask questions and you found these answers helpful, make sure you give this video a big thumbs up. Make sure you guys are subscribed. Plenty of content coming in this preseason. Thumbs up, subscribe, 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts as well. And we'll see you guys next time. Laters.